On the bright, crowded market morning, a rich woman decided to make her own good name louder by breaking a poor one. The wealthy society woman, who owned the biggest event and gift emporium on the market and sat on the board every small seller, kept a license through swept down the lane, planted herself before a blind woman who weighed out loose glass and coral beads by the gram for a living, and told the whole gathered market that this blind seller was a thief. She said it plainly, so that every trader and every buyer crowding the bead lane could hear her, that this stall woman had taken her steward's money and shortchanged him on the weight and the change, cheated a paying customer because she thought a blind woman could deny anything and never be caught, robbed her household blind, and disgraced a woman who had only ever been good to the poor of this market. Ijeoma Nwosu did not weep, and she did not beg, and she did not grope for the rich woman's sleeve to plead, though the murmur of the market was already turning against her, and a board word could shut her stall by evening. She sat very straight behind her small bead counter, with one steady hand resting on the market's new gray weighing scale, the same machine that had rung and read aloud the price of every measure she had sold that season, and let the accusation break over her. Because there was nothing a poor blind woman could say into that powerful woman's certainty that the frightened market was ready to hear against her. And the society woman performing her outrage did not know that the machine under the blind woman's hand had been quietly keeping the one record able to turn her own accusation inside out, and that within days the Traders Association would pull up that scale's own silent log before this same crowd, and it would show, to the gram and the naira, exactly what had been weighed and paid and handed back at that counter, and whose hand had really taken the money that went missing. The market did the thing a crowd does when a big woman with power names a small one a thief first. It drew back from her. The traders with their own stalls, the loaders, the buyers, who had come only to spend and go home, looked at Ijeoma in her worn wrapper, sitting behind her bowls of beads with her sightless calm, and took their cue from the woman who owned the grandest emporium and held a seat on the board. Because a powerful person's certainty is contagious, and it is always safer to draw back from the accused than to stand beside her. A few of the older market women did not draw back. They frowned and looked at the little scale on the blind woman's counter, because they knew what it was to serve every buyer honestly all day and be the first blamed when a big household decided its money had gone short. But most of the market went with the chief missus, because that is how a theft is made to look like justice. You get the crowd to agree the poor woman is the thief, and then no one thinks to ask whose hand really took the money. And Ijeoma felt the heat climb up her neck and the smooth, cool casing of the scale under her fingers, and inside her, quiet under all the noise, the one thing the accusation could not reach, she knew what she was. She had weighed and sold honestly for years, given every buyer the exact change her hands counted and the machine confirmed, raised her young relative on the thin margin without begging or cheating, and never once shorted a single customer by a single bead or a single naira. She lifted her chin the way her mother had taught her at a bead tray when she was small, and said nothing aloud, because a woman who has served honestly in a market full of big names has already learned that the loudest voice does not decide whose hand did the taking. The society woman thought she was managing a small nuisance the way she managed every nuisance, by deciding who was low enough to be crushed, and doing it from a height where no one would argue. She had heard her steward's story, looked in her mind at a blind stall woman with no shop of her own and no powerful name behind her, and decided, in the space of a breath, that of course the blind seller had cheated. Of course a poor woman had preyed on the good faith of a customer who could not stand over her and watch. She had spent her whole comfortable life seeing in people like Ijeoma not what they gave with their careful hands, but how easily their word could be overridden by hers. Ijeoma Nwosu was 54 years old, and in that market she was known by nearly everyone and truly seen by almost no one. The blind bead woman. The one who weighed out loose coral and glass beads by the gram at a small stall and counted your change back into your palm by touch. She had lost the last of her sight many years before, slowly, to an illness the clinics could not turn back, and she had not lost her trade with it, because her hands had learned the beads and the weights and the coins so thoroughly that she could serve a whole day's buyers without a single mistake, reading the world through her fingers and her ears, the way the sighted never learn to. She rose each morning before the market filled, in the single rented room where she lived with the younger relative she was raising, and set out for her stall, and there she sat all day, weighing, pricing, counting change, greeting every hand that touched her counter by the feel and the voice of it. She earned a thin margin for the patient work, taking so slight that one bad week, a slow season, a customer who never came, could leave her tin nearly empty. She was, everyone agreed, honest and gentle, and she had learned long ago that being poor and blind and reliable at once only meant people leaned on your steadiness and forgot your name. The blind bead woman, they called her, half in fondness, and most of them did not know the half of what she carried, nor what one big woman's household had been about to cost her. She had not been handed her trade. No one hands a blind woman a living. She had built it herself, over years, the way the poor build anything that lasts, slowly, with sacrifice, and with far more discipline than the comfortable ever imagine. She had learned beads at her mother's side, who had strung and sold them in the same market before her, and when the darkness closed over her own eyes, she had refused to let it close over her livelihood too, teaching her fingers what her eyes could no longer do, memorizing the weights and the prices, training herself to count coins and notes by their size and their folds, and the trust of the hand that gave them. She saved what she could in an old tin, toward the one thing she wanted in the world, to lift her young relative out of the thin corner of that rented room and into a life with a proper roof and school fees paid without fear. And she kept, at her counter, the things that let a blind woman trade in a sighted world with her honor whole: a trained memory, an honest hand, a young apprentice's watchful eyes, and, newest of all, the market's own machine. Her days were long, and they were the same, and there was a kind of pride in the sameness. She weighed and priced and counted, buyer after buyer, because a woman known for an honest hand does not send a customer away a single bead or a single naira short. There were good weeks and lean weeks when she counted her coins twice and fed her young relative first and herself after, but she never once shorted a buyer or palmed a coin, because a poor woman's honest name was not a thing she traded when times were hard. It was the one thing that stayed hers no matter how hard they got. That was the woman the chief Mrs. looked at and saw a thief she could shut with a word. Because there had been, that very season, a change in the market that Ijeoma had welcomed more gladly than any other trader on the lane. The Traders' Association, wanting to end the endless disputes over weight and change that plagued a market of measured goods, had installed new shared digital weighing scales at every stall that sold anything by the gram. Licensed machines that did not only weigh, but read the weight and the price aloud in a clear voice, and quietly kept a record of every transaction. The exact time, the weight weighed out, the price rung, the amount tendered, and the change due, all of it logged to an account the association held, precisely so that no buyer and no seller could ever dispute a measure or a price after the fact. To most of the traders, it was a small convenience and a small nuisance both. To a blind woman, it was something close to a gift. For the first time in all her years of trading, Ijeoma had a machine that would speak the price aloud so her buyers heard the same number she did, that would confirm with its own voice the weight her fingers judged, and that would keep, in a record no one could later twist, the plain truth of every sale she made. She had taken to it at once. She asked every buyer to let the scale ring and read the price. She tendered and returned change hand to hand while the machine listened, and she trusted the log to hold what her eyes could not see. Because a blind woman who trades honestly has every reason to love a machine that remembers. And there was one more thing that set Ijeoma apart. A young woman named Chidalu Eze, a bright, serious young adult who had come to learn the bead trade at the blind woman's side. Chidalu was old enough to run the stall alone on the days Ijeoma's chest was bad, old enough to carry the heavy bead sacks and haggle with the wholesalers, and she stood at the counter through the long days learning the weights and the prices and the honest way the blind woman did business. Ijeoma had taken her on the way her own mother had once taken on girls, to pass a trade to a young pair of hands, and Chidalu had become, without either of them quite planning it, the blind woman's watching eyes. The young witness who stood at the counter and saw, plainly and with a clear head, exactly what was weighed, exactly what was paid, and exactly what change went back into which hand. Between the machine that remembered and the young woman who watched, Ijeoma traded a sighted trade with nothing hidden, and had thought, in her quiet way, that between the two of them she was as safe from a false word as a poor blind woman could ever hope to be. Here is the very thing this channel was built for. So let me say it to you plainly before we go on. If you have ever served a powerful person honestly with your own careful hands, given them exactly what they were owed down to the last coin, kept quiet, honest proof of it, because you sensed that one day someone powerful would call you the cheat, then you already belong here with us, under the Baobab. Take one moment to subscribe to Baobab Tales, because the quiet, overlooked people who serve honestly while the powerful decide their word is worth nothing, and who have one small record that turns it all around, are exactly the ones these stories are told for. And I do not want you to miss what a rich woman's lie was about to do to Ijeoma Nwosu in that crowded market, or what one silent machine and one clear young witness were about to do right back. To understand the woman sitting accused in that market, you have to understand the woman who owned the emporium. Her name was Chief Mrs. Folasade Coker, a wealthy society woman in her 50s, who had built a great name out of an event and gift emporium that outfitted the weddings and society galas of half the city, addressed as Chief Mrs. by everyone who wanted to keep a stall on the good end of that market. She was not, to look at her, a wicked woman. She sat on the Traders Association board and gave to her church, and was forever spoken of as a benefactress of the trade. The big woman who could put the finest gel and the richest gift into any celebration in Lagos. But under the heavy lace and the gold and the easy public warmth, she was a woman who had never once imagined she could be in the wrong, who treated the poor of the market as furniture that fetched and carried, and who let her household run her errands and her money without ever counting either. The cruelty in that market did not come from a criminal in the shadows. It came from a respectable big woman who believed her own household by reflex, and a poor woman's word not at all, which is a colder and more dangerous thing. And the thing that made Ijeoma dangerous to such a woman was the one thing she had never thought a poor blind seller would possess: a plain record of exactly what her hands had done, kept by a machine that could not be bullied, and seen by a young witness who could not be bought. For the whole lie rested on a simple certainty that a blind woman could never prove what had happened at her own counter. A blind seller, the reasoning went, has no eyes to have seen the money change hands, no way to swear to a weight or a count, only her word. And a poor blind woman's word is nothing against a rich woman's loss and a household steward's story. Chief Mrs. Coker had never framed anyone in her life. Not knowingly. She simply could not conceive that her own steward might lie, or that a blind stall woman might be believed over him. She had never imagined that among the sellers on that lane there was a blind woman whose every sale was rung and read aloud and silently logged by the market's own machine, and watched by a clear-eyed young apprentice who would swear to what she saw. She looked at Ijeoma and saw a thief too helpless to argue. She did not see the record that had been keeping itself against her steward's lie. The morning the sky broke came bright and busy. Word already running through the market that the great emporium's household had been robbed. Chief Mrs. Coker had a grand society commission coming, a wealthy family's wedding for which she was to supply the jewel and the beaded accessories, and, as she so often did, she had sent her household steward down to the bead lane to buy the coral and glass beads for it in bulk. That steward's name was Emeka, a hard, brisk man who had run the great woman's errands and handled her cash for years. Trusted with more money in a week than most of the market saw in a month, and never once made to account for a naira of it. He had come to Ijeoma's stall with a thick roll of his mistress's money and an order for a costly quantity of the good coral and the fine glass beads, and Ijeoma had served him exactly as she served everyone. Better, if anything, knowing the order was large, she had let the scale weigh and read each measure aloud, rung the price for him to hear, taken the sum he tendered, and counted his change back into his hand, coin and note, under Chitalu's watching eyes and the machine's silent record, and had thought no more of it than of any large job carefully done. She did not know, as she smiled him off with his heavy bags of beads, that the money in his pocket was already more than it should have been, or that her honest service had just been made, in his mouth, into her crime. It was the wrong thing to be blamed for in a rich woman's market. Because what had happened between her counter and the great emporium, Ijeoma did not yet know, but would soon prove, was this: the steward Emeka, carrying his mistress's thick roll of money, and knowing she never counted it, had taken his correct change from the blind woman's hand, walked out of the lane, and quietly peeled off a fat slice of the cash for himself, and then, to cover the hole in the money he brought back, had gone to his mistress with a ready story. He did not wait to be asked why the sum was short. He told her, before she could count a note, that the blind bead woman had cheated him, short-changed him on the weight and on the change, handed back far too little, and dared him to prove it, because everyone knew a blind seller could deny anything and never be caught. And Chief Mrs. Coker, who never counted her money and never doubted her household, believed him in the space of a breath. And her outrage was immediate and total. She did not go quietly to the association with a complaint. She swept down to the market that same bright morning, and she branded the blind woman before the whole crowd. She stood before Ijeoma's little stall in her lavish gel and her heavy gold, and told the gathered market that this blind seller was a thief. She said that this stall woman had taken her steward's money and short-changed him shamelessly on the weight and the change, that she had preyed on a paying customer because she thought a blind woman could lie about anything and never be caught, that she had robbed the household of a woman who had only ever been a friend to the poor of this market, and that the little machine on her counter was nothing but a prop a cheat hid behind to look honest while she robbed her betters. She said the blind woman owed back every naira and more for the disgrace, and that she, as a member of the Traders Association Board, would see her license pulled and her stall shut by nightfall, and she gave the market her certainty to feed on. And the crowd began to draw back from the blind woman and murmur, "The poor cheat caught at last. The blind thief who thought her darkness would hide her." And the awful machinery of it turned, not an engine of steel, but the older machinery, the one that turns an honest poor woman into a thief the instant a rich woman needs one. Ijeoma sat in that bright market among her bowls of beads and did not break. When the rich woman's voice rose over her, she did not throw up her hands and wail, and she did not grope for the woman's feet to beg, and she did not curse her. She sat very straight, with one hand resting on the cool casing of the scale where its silent record was kept, and the other flat on her counter, and she let the great woman make her show, because she understood something the market did not. She understood that a woman does not stand in a public lane shouting a blind seller down as a thief, unless she is somewhere afraid of what an honest record might show. Her loudness was not strength, but a household's rotten story, wearing strength's clothes. And Ijeoma said, once, clearly, so that the older women at the edge of the lane heard her, that every measure she sold that man had been weighed and read aloud by the market's own scale, that the machine had kept the record of the weight and the price and the change, that her young apprentice had stood right there and seen the money counted back into his hand, and that she would ask the association to simply pull up the scales log and read it, and that a woman who feared a machine's plain record had something of her own to hide. Then she sat with her hand on the machine and her chin up, while the rich woman swept away, promising to have her shut. And behind her, the market buzzed, and Chief Mrs. Coker announced she would be bringing the matter before the board to have the blind cheat's license pulled, which was the proudest, most fatal mistake a lying household ever leaned on. Because in her certainty that a blind woman could never prove what had happened at her counter, Chief Mrs. Coker did the one thing that would undo her. She took the matter to the very people who kept the machine's record. To make her ruin of the blind woman look like the orderly justice of the trade, rather than the bullying it was, and to be seen doing right by her own good name, she demanded a formal hearing before the Traders Association Board, the same board that had installed the scales and held their logs, to have Ijeoma's license pulled, her stall forfeit, and her name struck from the market. She was so sure the blind woman's helplessness would damn her that she called the case before the very body that could, with a few taps, pull up the exact record of the exact sale, and read out to the gram and the naira what had truly happened. She thought she was summoning the trade to witness the blind cheat's punishment. She was summoning it to witness her stewards, and her own. This is the moment the channel was built to make you feel. So sit with it for one breath before we go on. Because if you have ever been called a thief by the very household that was robbing you, and been so sure of your own honest hands that you longed for someone with the record and the authority to simply come and read it, pull up the true account, in the open where no rich woman's shouting could bend it, then you already know exactly how Ijeoma's heart rose and shook when she learned that the Chief Mrs. herself had taken the matter to the board that kept the scales log. If you've made it this far into Ijeoma Nwosu's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Word of the coming hearing traveled the market fast, and it steadied a young woman who had been sick with fury since the moment the rich woman first raised her voice. Chidilu Eze, the blind woman's young apprentice, had stood at that counter through the whole of the sale the steward now called a cheating, and she had seen, with her own clear eyes, every gram weighed, and every naira counted back into the man's hand, and she knew, with the whole certainty of a person who was simply there, that Ijeoma had not shorted him by so much as a single bead. She was young, and she was poor, and she was frightened of the great woman's power the way any young trader would be. But she had a spine her mistress had helped put in her, and she went to Ijeoma, where the older woman sat quietly waiting out the storm, took her hand, and told her plainly that she had seen it all, and would stand up before the whole board and swear to it, come what may. And Ijeoma, who had trained those honest eyes herself, held the young woman's hand and told her the thing that mattered most, that she must simply tell the plain truth of what she saw, no more and no less, because the truth of an honest witness and the record of an honest machine, set side by side, were stronger than any rich woman's certainty. Between the young woman's eyes and the machine's memory, the blind seller was not helpless at all. She was the one trader on that lane who could prove, past denying, exactly what her hands had done. And there was one more quiet friend the storm had woken. A member of the Traders Association, an older man named Baba Sunday, who had pushed hardest of all the board members to install the honest scales in the first place, had heard the rich woman's very public accusation with a slow, professional unease. He had wanted the machines precisely so that a big customer's word could never again crush a small seller's in a dispute over weight and change. And here, before the ink on the new scheme was dry, was the market's grandest board member trying to shut a blind woman's stall on nothing but a steward's word, as if the log the very scales kept did not exist. He sought Ijeoma out, told her who he was and how the record worked, and explained the thing that turned her helplessness into a case. That the scale at her stall had logged that entire sale, the time, the weight, the price, the sum tendered, and the change due. All of it held safe in the association's own account, and that all the board had to do was pull it up and read it. He explained, too, what the reading would show. That the machine's cold record and Chitalu's clear account would match each other exactly, weight to weight and naira to naira, and that whatever money the steward claimed was missing had plainly never left the blind woman's hands at all. The proof of her innocence was also the proof of the steward's theft, and hers was the one sale on that lane recorded plainly enough to lay it bare. And so, on the day the chief missus had chosen for the blind woman's punishment, the association's meeting spilled out into the market so the whole lane could watch. Board members at a long table set out in the bright hard light, the blind woman's little scale carried up and set on the table beside a laptop that held the market's logs, and Chief Mrs. Coker sweeping in with her steward at her shoulder, and her certainty worn like her gold, sure of the verdict before a word was read. She had summoned this. She had staged it. She wanted the whole market to watch the blind cheat struck from the trade. She did not know that the plain older board member setting up the laptop had fought to install the very scales that were about to speak, or that the young apprentice standing quietly beside the blind woman had seen the whole sale with her own eyes and would swear to it, or that the machine on the table remembered, to the gram and the naira, exactly what her steward had done. The board did what such a body does when the record itself can settle a dispute. It went to the machine before it went to the shouting. Baba Sunday, with the other members leaning in, pulled up the transaction log for Ijeoma's stall for that exact morning, and found the steward's sale, timed to the minute he had stood at her counter. And he read it out to the market, plainly, line by line. He read the weight of coral and glass beads weighed out, the very quantity the steward had ordered. He read the price the machine had rung and spoken aloud, the price the blind woman had named. He read the sum the steward had tendered, the thick roll of his mistress's money. And he read the change the machine had recorded as due and given, exact to the last naira. The change Ijeoma had counted back into the man's own hand, and every figure matched, to the gram and to the naira, exactly what the blind woman had said from the first, and left not one coin of the shortfall the steward claimed anywhere in that record at all. The money the steward swore the blind woman had shortchanged him had never gone missing at her counter. It had left her hands in full. And to be certain, the board did not stop at the machine. They turned to the young apprentice, Chitalu, and asked her to tell the market what she had seen, and the young woman, frightened but steady, told it plainly, that she had stood at the counter through the whole sale, watched the scale weigh each measure, heard it read the price aloud, seen the steward hand over his roll of money, and seen Ijeoma count the change back into his palm, coin and note, exactly as the log now showed, and that the blind woman had not shorted him by a single bead. Her clear young account and the machine's cold record fell together like two halves of one truth, weight for weight and naira for naira, and a sound went through the packed market, not a shout, but a low, cold intake of breath from 100 people who understood, all at once, that if the weight was right and the change was right, and the record and the witness agreed, then the money the steward said was missing had never gone missing at Ijeoma's stall at all, and the question was suddenly, terribly, where it had gone after. Then the board turned to the question the rich woman had not wanted asked. if the blind woman had weighed true and given full change, and the log and the witness both said she had. Then the shortfall, the steward reported, had opened somewhere between the blind woman's counter and his mistress's hand. And for that, Baba Sunday reconciled the steward's own account against the record. The sum his mistress had given him to carry, plain from her own reckoning, once she was finally made to state it, the price the scale had rung, and the change it had returned, and the smaller sum the steward had actually brought back to the great emporium. And the gap stood open in the middle of it, plain as day. A fat slice of money that the machine's log proved had left the blind woman's hands in the steward's pocket, and that the steward's own returned sum proved had never reached his mistress. It had not vanished at the blind woman's counter. It had vanished into the steward's own pocket on his own walk home, and his cheating story had been built to cover the whole. The theft the rich woman had come to punish had been done not by the blind seller she shamed, but by the man standing at her own shoulder. And then, to close the trap the rich woman herself had sprung, the board pressed the steward where he stood, and the man who had been so ready with his story before a mistress who never doubted him had nothing to say before a machine that remembered, and a young witness who had watched. He blustered, as such men do, that the blind woman and the girl had somehow arranged their lies together, that the machine was wrong, that he had counted the change himself and been shorted. But it was too late for that, before a board that had just read the scale's own log and heard a clear young account that matched it to the naira. A man who has sworn a blind woman shortchanged him cannot. When the record shows the change was full and the missing money traces to his own returned sum, pretend the machine and the girl conspired against him. Baba Sunday laid the figures side by side on the table. The log, the witness, the sum sent and the sum returned, and asked the steward, in front of everyone, to account for the difference. And the man's face told the market the answer before his silence did. And the consequences did not stop at the market. The steward Emeka, who had carried his mistress's money, pocketed a slice of it and pinned the theft on a blind woman he thought too helpless to be believed, was exposed before the whole crowd, and when the police were brought in and the roll of money and his own account were pulled apart, the trail ran back through him, and only him. He was arrested and charged with theft, with stealing from his employer, and with the false accusation by which he had tried to send an innocent blind woman's ruin in place of his own. The great emporium's other affairs, once the household's money was finally looked at with open eyes, gave up more than one quiet shortfall that had always been blamed on someone poorer and weaker than the man who carried the cash. He had grown fat on the certainty that his mistress would never count, and a blind woman could never prove. And both certainties had failed him in the same bright hour, before the same watching market. And Chief Mrs. Coker, who had come to see a blind woman struck from the trade before an admiring market, and instead found the ground opening under her fine shoes, did the thing that told the whole lane what she was truly made of underneath. For a long moment she stood frozen in her gold and her lace, while the record was read, and her steward's silence damned him. And the market that had drawn back from Ijeoma turned, as one, and looked at her. And something in the proud woman broke. Not her pride only, but the hard shell of certainty that had let her crush a poor woman on a household's word without a second thought. She had been so sure. She had been so publicly, so cruelly sure. And she had been wrong in front of everyone. And the woman she had shamed was a blind seller who had done nothing all season but weigh true and count honest and welcome every hand that touched her counter. And Chief Mrs. Coker, to the astonishment of the whole market, went down. She lowered herself, in her heavy lace and her gold, onto the dusty market ground before the blind woman's little stall, and she knelt, and she took Ijeoma's hand. And she apologized, brokenly and out loud, before the entire crowd she had gathered to watch the blind woman's shame. for calling her a thief, for believing her own household over an honest woman's word, for the disgrace she had tried to lay on a person who had only ever dealt fairly with everyone. The great woman knelt in the dust, and the market watched a proud name humble itself before a poor one, and no one who saw it ever forgot it. And the board did the rest in the open, the part this channel does not skip, because a wrong undone in a whisper is no justice the world can see. The Traders' Association declared. Before the whole packed market the chief missus had gathered to watch the blind woman's shame, that the record and the witness cleared Ijeoma Nwosu entirely. That she had weighed true, and given full and exact change, and shorted no one, just as she had always said, and that the fault lay wholly with the steward, who had robbed his own mistress and blamed a blind woman for it. There would be no license pulled, no stall shut. Instead, the board struck the false complaint from the record and set down, for the whole market to hear, that the blind seller's honesty was proven past any doubt by the market's own machine. And Baba Sunday, permitted to speak as the board member who had fought for the honest scales, told the market in plain, merciless words what the whole affair had truly been, that a rich household's own thief had tried to buy his cover with an innocent blind woman's ruin, and that only the machine's patient record and a young woman's honest eyes had stood between him and getting away with it, as such men so often did against sellers who had neither. The market that had murmured against Ijeoma in the bright sun now spoke her honesty up and down the lane, and it was a good name no amount of the rich woman's money could have bought her. For Ijeoma, the turn was not a windfall so much as a door. The world forced, at last, to admit what her hands and her honesty had always been. Her name was cleared before the whole market that had watched her shamed, and cleared not by mercy, but by the plain record, which is the only clearing that truly holds. The disgrace the rich woman had tried to lay on her fell away, and in its place came a standing she had never had. The blind seller, whose honesty the market's own machine had proven, the trader everyone now wanted to buy from, because everyone now knew that her counter was the straightest on the lane. Chief Mrs. Coker, humbled and in earnest, made what amends a person can. She paid Ijeoma generously for the wrong and the fright, sent the great emporium's own steady bead custom to the blind woman's stall from then on, and spoke of her, ever after, not as furniture, but as the honest woman who had taught a proud one a lesson she had needed her whole life. The extra custom and the amends became the small capital Ijeoma had never been able to save, and she made of it exactly what everyone who had ever trusted her careful hands might have guessed she would. A bigger and better bead stall, more stock, a second scale, and a real future for the young relative she was raising, whom she lifted out of the thin corner of that rented room and into a proper home with school fees paid without the old fear. And Cheetaloo, the young apprentice whose honest eyes had helped save her mistress, found in the aftermath that she had become something in that market. The young woman who had stood up before the great Chief Mrs. Coker and the whole board and told the plain truth and been proven right. Ijeoma made her a full partner in the growing trade in time. And the two of them, the blind woman who remembered by touch and the young woman who watched with clear eyes, did the thing that turned the whole story into something larger than the two of them. Knowing how easily a big customer's word could still crush a small seller who had no record and no witness, they set about arming the market's other small measured goods sellers with the very things that had saved Ijeoma, to trust the new scales and let them keep the honest record, to ask every buyer to hear the price read aloud, and, wherever they could, to keep an honest pair of watching eyes at the counter through the day, so that a seller's plain truth would never again stand alone against a rich household's convenient lie. It was not a glossy scheme with ribbons and cameras. It was a plain, stubborn passing on of one blind woman's hard-won vindication to everyone still trading under the same sky, so that the next time a rich household's thief tried to blame the poor hand that served him, There would not be one blind seller with a machine and a witness to catch him, but a whole lane of sellers who knew the record was theirs to call on, and the truth theirs to prove. And on an evening months later, when the busy market had emptied and the bigger stall stood swept and quiet under the cooling sky, Ijeoma sat behind her counter, with one hand resting on the smooth, cool casing of the scale that had spoken for her when she could not see to defend herself. No longer a helpless woman waiting out a rich one's certainty, but the trader whose honesty a whole market now knew. The proof, kept and honored, that an honest hand and a true record held quietly through the lean years are stronger, in the end, than a rich woman's name raised against them. Her young relative slept under a proper roof, in a real home her own careful hands had at last been allowed to build. The great emporium's owner, humbled and better for it, sent her custom and her respect. And the crowd that had drawn back from the blind woman in the sun now came to her counter gladly, because they had learned, in one bright and terrible hour, that the loudest voice in a market does not decide the truth, and that a poor blind woman weighing beads by touch, with a machine that remembered and a young woman who watched, had been telling it all along. And so the fire burns low under the old Baobab tree. Tell me, before you go, when the powerful pin their own household's theft on the poor hand that served them honestly, and one silent machine and one honest young witness are all that stand between the truth and a lie, do you believe such cheating is always caught in the end, or only in the stories we tell under the tree? Stay a while, and tell me in the comments where you watched from.